Hi, everybody. Hope you'll forgive me. I'm a little bit late about tonight. I've been doing some thinking about what might prove to be a very big issue as we get into really facing our problems and beginning to solve them. Um, so, when I say we, of course, I mean we collectively. I mean we working through the federal government and through other institutions to solve uh, the uh, the very large variety of problems we face. Uh, the climate emergency, of course, uh, the need for a universal system, okay, of healthcare, um, trying to resolve the problem of an extreme amount, okay, of inequality in our society, just creating the kind of just and fair society that we would all like to see. Now, we've seen in the programs, okay, the agendas of some of our candidates, a wide variety of policies and programs put forward for our consideration. And some of these programs are very, very costly. We see a federal budget where we're already spending something like $4.6 trillion per year. We have a GDP of roughly 21 trillion. Okay, right now, we are currently looking at a federal deficit of $1 trillion. So, of course, the question arises: how much could we deficit spend? How much could we add to what the federal government actually spends to help to solve problems? How much, in terms of deficit spending, can we tolerate? The $1 trillion we're seeing now is less than a deficit. Okay, that is less than 5%. Okay, of GDP. So, what percent of GDP could we spend? Now, in discussing this in the past, what I've talked about is, well, let's take a look at our past experience and let's look at the leakages in terms of consumer demand we've seen in fairly recent years. And I pointed out that sometimes we have seen a leakage of 6% to foreign trade. And sometimes we've also seen a leakage of 6 or 7%, okay, or even more, okay, in one year as we were beginning to recover from the crash of 2008. But let's say savings, pulling consumption out of the economy, that would be roughly equal to 6%, okay, of GDP. Okay, so in the past, I've been saying to you that, well, if we take uh, if we simply take the position that we ought to deficit spend to make up for the leakages in consumer demand, if we take the leakage due to savings of 6% and the leakage due to foreign trade of, say, 6% okay, of GDP, we can afford to deficit spend perhaps 12% without anticipating any serious inflation. Well, 12% okay, of GDP right now, if we have a GDP of, let's say, $21 trillion, so 12% of that is roughly what, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6 trillion, somewhere in there. Now we're already deficit spending, okay, about $1 trillion. So that means we could afford to deficit spend $1.6 trillion more without actually wiping out some of the programs we have, or without actually adding to taxes. We might have enough in policy space for $1.6 trillion more per year in terms of deficit spending. But lately I've been thinking of how far beyond that could we go and still avoid inflation. And my thinking about this is at the beginning, but I found certain things to be okay, of interest in terms of the history of the United States. Before I go into that, though, I'd like to take a look at who's here on Facebook and to say hi to you. Hey, Sam Hollenbeck, how you doing? Nice to see you. Okay, and also Dolores Pierce. Hey, Dolores, how are you? Great to see you here. And Steve Wolfbrandt, hello to you. And hi, Bonnie. And hi, Greg Mallard. Glad to see you here as well. Sam says, hey, long time no see. Yeah, it is a long time no see. I'm very sorry for that, Sam. And Matthew Jochum has joined. Thank you very much for coming. It's nice to see you here. Okay, what I'm going to do now is to share to share a small graphic. Okay, Bonnie is telling me there's a problem with my sound. So what I'd like to do is to find out if it's a problem with my sound or simply with Bonnie's system. How's my sound? Okay, is it pretty good, everybody? If you give me some feedback on that, I'd greatly appreciate it. Sam says, sounds okay. Okay, thank you, Sam. Okay, very good. I won't worry about it then. It's probably just a problem with one of my systems here. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen with you now. And the screen is a graphic I hastily had together this evening, so it's not very fancy, I'm afraid. But I think it tells an interesting story. So let's take a look at that story. So there we are. I hope you can see this. I'm going to check in on Facebook and make sure you got it. Okay. Here we are. I don't see that you've got. Oh, there you go. Okay, you should be able to see it now just fine. Okay, so here's a very small chart. And you can see the years in the first column. And the period of time I'm looking at covers 1939 to 1949. You'll notice in the second column, I have the surplus or the deficit for the United States. And you should be able to see that there were very moderate deficits in 1939, 1940, and in 1941. The inflation rates were extremely moderate. In 1939, the deficit was 3.1% of GDP. And the inflation rate, which is over in the third column, was actually minus 1.4% of GDP. So the economy was going through a deflationary period in 1939. In 1940, we had a deficit of minus 3.0, and the inflation rate was 0.7. So very, very low inflation rate. It was very close to zero, even though we had a deficit of 3% of GDP. Now, I want to emphasize this, that in 1939 and also in 1940s, but in 1940, we didn't have really very much of a trade deficit. So there was not a big leakage to trade. And there was also not a very big leakage to savings. People were saving at that time, but we were far from a truly prosperous nation in 1939, and also, in 1940. So, from the standpoint of leakages of our consumer demand, we didn't have a lot of room either in 1939 or in 1940. In other words, we didn't have the kind of room we have now to actually run deficits without seeing, an inflation rate. In 1941, our deficit rose just a little. Wasn't as high in 1941 as it is right now. And the deficit was 4.3. And you see the inflation rate was 5.0. Far beyond the inflation rate we're seeing right now, which is somewhere around 2% or maybe even lower. So, 1941, of course, we were approaching World War II. In December 7th of 1941, we got into World War II in earnest. And so here we go into 1942, we start really major deficit spending. That 4.3% of GDP jumps to 13.9%. Really a substantial rise in terms of the deficit, and beyond anything we've seen here for a very long time. That was accompanied by a rise in inflation. It rose up to close to 11%, 10.9% in 1942. But in 1943, we really see the kicker. Our deficit goes up to nearly 30% of our GDP. It's 29.6%. But magic happens, right, in terms of what we would expect. The inflation rate goes down from 10.9 to 6.1%. How did that happen? Well, two things happened. A very, very heavy drive to sell savings bonds to all of us kicked in at that time, and wage and price controls also kicked in, okay, at that time. And it's these two measures that largely kept our inflation rate to 6.1%. When taking into account all our theories now, our inflation rate should have been much higher than that. That's the highest deficit we've ever run as a nation, nearly 30% of GDP. But this empirical data shows that, at least historically, at one point, we ran a deficit of 30% of GDP and experienced an inflation rate of only 6.1%. Now, how much is 30% of GDP? Well, our GDP right now is roughly $21 trillion. So, if we were operating with 30% of deficit spending right now, we would be deficit spending something like $6.1 trillion. And our total spending would be in the range of $10 trillion. Whereas right now, we're spending in the range of what? $4.5 trillion. So, at one time in our history, that's how much policy space was made available by the actions of the government of the United States. At one time, in 1943, in wartime, when there were no consumer goods to speak of to buy because the country was fully dedicated to the war effort. An industry wasn't making consumer goods or was making a minimum of consumer goods, and instead was spending on goods for supporting the war. It was a war economy. Let's look at 1944. 22.2% of deficit in 1944. And what was the inflation rate? Damn, it went down again from 6.1% to 1.7%. It went down. It was pretty negligible in 1944 with a deficit of 22.2%. Then, in 1945, our deficit dropped again, ever so slightly though, to 21% of GDP. But the inflation rate went up, even though our deficit had dropped. Even though the deficit spending shrank, our inflation rate went up to 2.3. Could that be because the war ended in 1945? And what we were seeing then was that the price controls were beginning to relax a little? Then, in 1946, our deficit spending fell to 7.0%. Still, probably 2.5% more than we're deficit spending right now. And the inflation rate went up to 8.3%. Why? That's got to be due to the fact that fewer savings bonds were getting sold because people wanted to consume and the economy was shifting to a consumer economy. But not fast enough. So the demand for goods was outpacing the supply. But the wage and price controls were also lifted. So we saw inflation jump to 8.3%. Then in 1947, we didn't have any deficit spending at all. We had a surplus of 1.7%. And by the way, by 1947, we also had a trade surplus. I haven't looked up how much the trade surplus was, but in those years, after the Second World War, the rest of the world was in collapse. And we had some major trade surpluses at that time. But in spite of the trade surpluses we had, in spite of that, with the relaxation of wage and price controls and a decline in savings bonds sales, and the conversion to a peacetime economy not yet in place, the huge demand created by wartime savings led to an inflation rate of 14.4%, the highest inflation rate during this period from 1939 to 1949. We have never had an inflation rate like this since. I believe that 14.4% is the highest inflation rate we have ever had in the modern period. So in 1948, our surplus grows to 4.5%. And I believe we were running a trade surplus then as well. And yet, the inflation rate still is fairly high at 8.1%. In 1949, though, things really moderate. This was just before the Korean War. Okay, remember? Okay, the surplus goes to 0.2%, okay, of GDP, and we see deflation in 1949. We see prices fall to minus 1.2. So, what story do we see over these 10 years? One thing is that we see a capability to create a sufficient amount of policy space to deficit spend 30% of our GDP and not have really serious inflation. In other words, no runaway inflation. A relatively high inflation rate at 6.1, but we were higher than that actually before, and we've been higher than that as well since. So we've seen that capacity of government, but to deficit spend. And we have not seen a very strong correlation between our deficit spending and the inflation rate. Because even when deficit spending was very high at 22.2, policy measures taken by the government were sufficient to tame inflation and bring it down to a fairly low rate at 1.7%. And in the year after, even a deficit of 21% was not sufficient to give us an inflation rate higher than 2.3%. So these historical data seem to suggest that we can have factual situations where our deficit spending is enormous by our current standards and where our inflation rates can still be brought under control. On the other hand, we also see instances where in certain years, sorry, okay, where in certain years we can have situations where we run surpluses, even a fairly fat one at 4.5%, and still have inflation rates far higher than we have now. So, what's the point of this? The point of it is to argue that what history shows us, is that we can, if need be, based on past history, we are able to deficit spend with a GDP of 21 trillion. We are able to deficit spend $6.3 trillion more as long as we're selling savings bonds, very broadly marketing it on a patriotic basis, and as long as we have wage and price controls in place. So, we know Bernie's Green New Deal plan is pegged at a cost of $1.6 trillion per year over 10 years, a little more than $1.6 trillion over 10 years. His healthcare plan, in my view, is probably going to cost, I know he's planning on more, the estimates are more, but I suspect it's only going to cost 2.6 or 2.7 trillion dollars over 10 years. So you add those two things together, you get $4.3 trillion over 10 years. There might be a few of his other programs which altogether, let's be liberal about it, might add up to another $1.5 trillion per year. So we're approaching now $6 trillion. What I'm doing here, what I want to do here, is to raise the question, just raise the question, get you thinking about, and get people thinking about, and maybe I'm all wet here. Maybe I'm all wet, but get you thinking of the possibility that we can afford, without even levying more taxes, the whole of Bernie's agenda. We can afford it all without any further taxation. Now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be further taxation. I'm happy to have the taxation. We need to build a more just and fair society. And that means that we have to lower the amount of inequality we have in our society, and we have to undermine the capacity of the very rich, both corporations and people, to undermine our political system. And that's going to require taxation. That's going to require taking the money away. But whether or not we take the money away, it seems clear, based on past history, that we can afford the kind of spending that is inherent in the proposals of Bernie Sanders and Warren and maybe Tulsi Gabbard, completely apart from whether we raise taxes to implement those particular programs. Okay, so that's my speculation. I'd like to check in with you now for some discussion. So here we go. Okay, so Randy Hedgebeth has joined. Jeff Ginter has joined. Hi to you both. Thank you for coming. Greg Mallet says bigger deficit rates equate to a stronger economy and more money going into the public purpose. Yes, I think so. If other supplementary policies are in place. Amberly Grigo is here too. Hi, Amberly. Very nice to see you. And Antonio Calho is here also. And Steve Day is here. Hi, Steve Day. Nice to see you. And Jimmy Sunderland has joined. It's very nice to see you, Jimmy. Thank you very much for coming. And Greg Mallard says budget surpluses are what causes economic crashes, just like the one from 2008 to 2009. Well, in contexts, when we have a leakage of demands to savings and to trade deficits, yes, yes, budget surpluses are what cause crashes. Absolutely. Of course, it also has to be the case that banks stop lending. So there are no bubbles, lending bubbles, sustaining the economy, which can only happen for so long before things uh, actually crash. And Steve Day says that explains why my dad explains my dad being a tightwad. Steve Day says it's boomer birthing time. Yes, it was at that time. And Charles Lovett has joined. Hi, Charles. Nice to see you. And Melissa Aguilar says budget surpluses on the federal level mean budget shortfalls on the consumer level. As long as that context is there, you always have to remember the context. In other words, there can't be some bubbles caused by uh, uh, um, uh, caused by the banks in the picture. Okay, and there also have to be some leakages to trade and leakages to savings. And Nancy Blackmar is here. Hi, Nancy. Great to see you. Greg says, I believe his Green New Deal plan would cost 16.6 trillion over 10 years. I thought the figure was 16.3 trillion, Greg, which averages out to 1.63 trillion per year over 10 years. Greg also says Bernie's whole entire agenda would rebuild the middle class and would not cost the taxpayers anything. We need the right folks elected to Congress to be sure his plans are introduced into Congress on the legislative level. Yes, we do. He needs a progressive Congress behind him, or at least one that is willing to support him. And Steve Day says, Tulsi, tune in with Joe Firestone. And Jeff Denton says, I can't help but get a corporate feeling about Elizabeth Warren. Yes, a number of us feel that way. Hi again, Jimmy. And hi, Charles. Yeah, I get a corporate feeling from her too. I was looking at her plan for health care, and it's all very ambiguous. In one breath, she's saying she's a supporter of of Medicare for all, and then she talks about all the other things she supports, which of course would not be necessary if she passed the Medicare for all bill. And Greg says, "What are my thoughts on West Virginia U.S. Senator candidate, Paula Jean Swearingen?" Well, my thoughts on her is it would be wonderful if she got elected because she's sure to be far better than, is it Shelley Capito? She's sure to be a great improvement on Shelley Capito and relatively progressive, I think. She is, after all, a Justice Democrat. And Jimmy Sunderland says exactly, even if Bernie wins, if House and Senate isn't for him, he won't get much passed. That's true. He won't get much passed. But he can do a lot of damage to the other side and a lot of good things for us simply with executive orders. And if he doesn't get a House and Senate that's for him in the presidency, he could really begin to campaign hard for the 2002 congressional elections to turn those around. However, I point out that if he is successful in running a progressive campaign and winning the presidency, at this point, there's a very high likelihood he's going to have the House with him. It'll be a stretch for him to have the Senate as well, but he has a chance to get that too. And if he doesn't get it for 2021, with the continuing campaign he intends to run, whether he wins or not, with that in place and the millions of people taking part in that particular campaign, I think he's sure to get the Senate in 2022 and to be ready to go for broke in 2023. So while it would be a tragedy if the Senate is able to block much of what he wants to do in 2021, he's not going to play the Republicans the way Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, are playing them. He's going to play the Republicans an entirely different way. He's going to hang everything around their neck. Every failure is going to be around their neck. And it's going to rev up his crew all through this time. Gary Houck has joined. Thank you, Gary, for joining us. Okay. Are there other comments? Okay, I'll give you a minute to get them in. Oh, okay. Steve Day would like me to give my calculation supporting the claim that we have a better deal than a UBI. Okay, my calculation is actually like this. Uh, First, we have a job guarantee. Now, I would not advocate for a job guarantee of $15. Okay, I know Bernie, okay, is doing that now. I think that he needs to rev that up. I think the best way to rev it up at this point and to have the politics actually make sense is to set up the job guarantee. Oh, hi, Margot Shepard. Is to set up the job guarantee with a $15 minimum, a $15 minimum on the job guarantee wage. Now, that $15 an hour would apply to the lowest cost area in the United States, an extremely rural area with very low living costs. There are still certain areas, okay, in the United States where you can get a house for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. Okay, in areas like that, the cost of living is fairly low. Okay, and $15 an hour might actually be a living wage. But then I propose that there are regional cost of living adjustments too, so that the highest job guarantee wage could be up in Alaska or maybe in the New York area, in parts, okay, of California too. We might see job guarantee wages as high as $30 per hour as a living wage. Now, the better deal comes in. It comes in this particular context. Andrew Yang's his idea, okay, of a UBI is set at $1,000 a month or $12,000 a year. It isn't regionally cost adjusted. The way we would set our BI, okay, now what I'm proposing to go along with the job guarantee, okay, is not a UBI, okay, but a BI. Okay, for those who, for one reason or another, are not able to fit into the job guarantee program. We offer a BI, and the rate for the BI would be 2/3 of the job guarantee wage, also cost adjusted across the country. So, for example, 2/3 of a living wage of $15 an hour would be $10 an hour. So, the $10 an hour for 2,080 hours per year, that's not $12,000 a year. That comes to close to $21,000 per year. If, let's say, the average job guarantee wage across the United States is the cost adjusted job guarantee wage is, let's say, it may be about $20 an hour. Then the BI stipend equivalent would be pegged at, what is that? Something like $13.66 per hour, something like that. Stephen Day says 2/3 of 15. Well, I'm taking as an example. Okay, a living wage average, okay, of $20 an hour, okay, across the United States. So it would be 2/3 of $20 times 40 times 52. Yeah, so that would be the calculation. So what is that, Steve? I mean, I have a calculator here. I can do that. Okay, so Jimmy says to live here in Southern California, you have to make a minimum of $30 per hour. So $30 per hour is roughly what? That's what, $63,000 per year. So 2/3 of that for a basic income is going to be in the neighborhood of about $40,000 a year. That's a lot better than Andrew Yang's $12,000 a year, right? So Jimmy says, I was just looking at places today, no less than $2,000 per month for a 2-bedroom apartment. It's roughly the same here in the Washington area, Jimmy. In some areas of the Washington area, it's higher than that. In some areas, okay, it's less than that. Where I live in Ashburn, it's probably $1,600 a month, but certain housing is subsidized by the federal government, and there the rentals may be less. For example, senior housing here actually goes for less, and then there's also a Section 8 subsidy which can supplement that. And Greg says we need national rent control laws along with the strict kinds, okay, of regulations on rental costs. Yes, we do. And Steve Day says the regional cost of living adjustments. So, Steve, that's why it's a better deal. In certain areas of the country, it could be more than 3 times better than Andrew Yang's deal. And by the way, the BI and also the JG would not be offered with any requirement to give up other safety net programs currently in place. That could be a consequence of the kinds of requirements that happen to attach to those programs now. But it wouldn't be something written into the JG bill. In other words, there wouldn't be anything that forces people into a trade-off if they continue to qualify for the social safety net programs. They could have those too. So BI would be new, not SSDI. No, it wouldn't be SSDI. It would be new. It would be something on top of that. And the BI would not be a universal BI. Now, to be fair, the Yang gang would come back, okay, Andrew Yang, okay, would come back and say, but if you're offering a BI, that means there would be a means test for it. And that means we maintain a bureaucracy. We have to have a new bureaucracy to means test it and to investigate people. And my answer to that is no. There doesn't have to be a new bureaucracy. All there has to be is we would have to provide for an application to the federal government to take a BI. And then we'd have to have a rule enforced by the IRS. In other words, the bureaucracy that's already there, to take back that part of the BI that was not needed because people had income from jobs they took in the private sector or from participating in the JG program, okay, or from other sources, okay, of earnings. In other words, the means test for the BI would be that the BI would be the primary source, okay, of income, and that the people involved would not have substantial wealth. Now, I know I'm being vague by saying substantial wealth. My point is, if someone was wealthy enough to live off the interest or live off the rents or things like that, then they would not be eligible for the BI. Okay, but if the BI was the main source of their income and the primary source of their savings, then they could take a BI and there would be no penalties by the IRS, no recapture. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if people register for it, give them the money up front. Then later on, if they've taken too much, the IRS can recapture it. So no new bureaucracy, just the IRS. I think we can live with that. So I think the additional bureaucracy argument by the UBIers is overblown and doesn't stack up well against the idea that people who do not need a BI would automatically get it. Yes, I don't mean to touch the SS program or the SSDI program. Okay, I do not mean to touch those. But this is my proposal. In other words, it may be that Bernie would say, have some other kind of rule if he went for this kind, okay, of proposal. It may be some others would have some kind of rule. But the proposal that I advocate for is that if you need a primary source of income and a primary source from which you can save, and you cannot fit into any of the job sectors, the private sector, the government sector, or the JG sector, then you're entitled to a BI. And Steve Day says Joe's proposal is good for the battle with the Yang, the Yang Gooby, the Yang Goobai. Okay, I'll tell you, when I listen to Yang, sometimes, I like him. He's a clever guy. He's an attractive guy in some ways. But for him, everything is about the individual. Okay, it seems to me. In other words, he reeks of a charitable kind of um, economic neoliberalism, okay, and also a charitable kind of he reeks of someone who's a libertarian at heart and who wants as little government, okay, as possible, and who will always seek to check the government. And Greg says he seems like a predator type of candidate. That's just the vibe, okay, I get from him. I don't get that kind of vibe from him, but I do see a certain lack, okay, of caring. I think he's the kind of guy who puts together proposals that may be attractive to many people, and for those who do not stand to benefit from his proposals, well, he's okay with that. So he's okay with the idea that Donald Trump gets his additional 12,000 a month under all conditions. However, the Social Security recipient or the SSDI recipient, okay, I should say, uh, who makes a choice that he's going to continue to take the SSDI because it's more than the amount, okay, of the UBI. That it's okay with him that those people don't get any benefit out of the UBI. So they don't get to exercise their right to a UBI, but the richest people in America get to exercise their right to a UBI. That really sticks in my craw. Really sticks in my craw. Steve Day says a program of attraction, not not a program of macroeconomic but function. Yes, I completely agree with that. He ignores the collective effects of his program continuously. And Steve Day says strange pocket change. Yes, I agree with that too. Strange pocket change. And it is pocket change compared to my deal. It's pocket change compared to my deal. In most of the United States, with the cost of living adjustment actually thrown in, the deal that I'm proposing is twice as good as the Yang deal. It's twice as good for most of the population of the United States. Okay, any other thoughts or comments? If not, then thank you all for coming, and thank you all for the discussion. I also want, before I leave, to do what I should have done before, which is call your attention to please share, like, and subscribe, and please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. I know everybody wants patrons. Well, that's the way it's got to be because we spend an awful lot of time at this. And we got to keep the lights on. There's no way to erase that need, except to have gotten rich somewhere along the line. I unfortunately was never fortunate enough to do that. So Russ says, see you again soon. Yeah, I'll be here tomorrow night at roughly 9. Charles says, thank you for your teaching and enlightenment, Dr. Joe. And Sam says, good night, Joe, and thanks. And thank you for coming, Sam. And thank you for coming, Jimmy. Nice to see you too. And good night, all. I'll see you tomorrow.